kind of be building on some of the topics from yesterday, these routes that we can create in our Angular application. This is probably not going to be a super lengthy lecture this morning, because what we'll do this afternoon, we'll do another full mean style demo. But what I'll probably do for time's sake is I'll have the Express server set up ahead of time, because you guys have seen that now in 2 videos. We went over the Express server. We built one up from scratch. I'll create one ahead of time, so that way this afternoon we can just really get into Angular and dealing with our components and dealing with accessing the Express server. So that'll be this afternoon. What we're going to talk about today is a couple concepts, because honestly, after routing, or including routing, you guys have kind of seen sort of the full picture of me. Now there's still a couple topics that I talked about that we won't necessarily lecture for. You'll find them in the optional section. What would one of those be at least? Outputs, right? And what does an output do for us? Okay, fair enough. What is an output? Does anyone know what an output does?
I think so.
Okay.
I think it allows you to, manipulate a child component or change a child component, and that, with an output, you would allow that to change the parent component or something like that.
Yeah, it's a way for the child component to communicate up the chain, to tell the parent that something happened. The child component says, hey, this event happened, and the parent component has a way to understand that event happening. And when we start to nest things, this gets really important, right? Because how do I tell, say, if I have a system where, going off of the records thing that we had yesterday, or that we've been working at, right? We got this records application, where let's say that my single app component, I have my main thing that's created with my project, right? This app component. Then let's say, this entire thing is app component. Then let's say that for each record, I do an ng4. Not even talking about routing at this point, but just an ng4 saying, hey, make this little record box for each of these things, right? So actually create app record, right? Which is how I could essentially nest or set a component inside of an existing component via the HTML, right? So I can say app record. Actually, I'll leave this open, because I would say something like ng4, and I would say let record of records, right? My data source, essentially, my thing that exists in the app component TS file, my all records array, or my records array, right? So create an app record component for each record that exists. And I would also send it via an input to the actual record. So that looks like somewhere in here I would have said record equals record. Now, how does the syntax work again? Which one's which?
The one in the brackets is from the input.
The one in the brackets is going to be the child. This is essentially the child's variable, the child's data, right here. That will be what we, in the child, you set up an input called record, or even in this case, let's call it R to differentiate. Might make it a little clearer. So R, I'd have a variable in the child component TS file, the record component TS file, called R. Where's this record coming from? Where do you think? The parent, right? The let record of records, right? So I'm saying for each one of these records that exist in the array, take that record variable that I've got, send it to the child, so the child can have that thing. Now, this works, inputs like this work, when we're dealing just with immediate children, just with actually having this tag here in the parent component HTML, and saying, I'm just going to create, just like I would create a p tag or an h1 tag, I'm going to create an app record tag and give it some data from the parent. So I'm sending it downward. Now when we introduce routing, it's kind of counter to this idea. Routing doesn't allow us to do an input the same way. Routing essentially says we have to have some way for each of the components shown to connect to the service, rather than sending the information down to the children. So it's a little funky, but say this whole page, right? The diagram I drew yesterday where we had, the add page and the edit page and the all page and the single page, right? Working more like pages that we've seen in the past, like whole templates, each one of those things would essentially be in charge of communicating with the service itself. It's not relying on the app component anymore. It itself is talking to the service to get its data. Let's bring it back for a second, though, before we go down that hole, because I want to talk about the first topic we were discussing, which was outputs, right? So if I have just this child component, and I send it some data record. This child component, let's say it has its title, yeah, and it's got its artist, woo, Backstreet Boys, right? Or was it NSYNC? I forget. Yeah. All right, and let's say we have a delete button and a view button or something like that, right? Let's just go with delete for now. So this child component, each of these actually not only has the data that we want to display, but also some delete button, right? So if I actually looked at the child component of the HTML, I'd see, H3 title, P tag artist, button, click, calling a function. Now, conceptual question, where do you think that function would have to live? Would it live in the child component TS or the parent component TS?
Which function?
So say this button, right? This is all part of the record component that I'm creating, the child component. The delete button lives in the child component's HTML. If there's a click that's attached to the delete function, right? We have that event, the click event, and it's going to call a function. Where is that function? Would it be on the child component TS file or the parent component TS file?
Child.
I hear some childs, I hear some parents. What's the argument for it being on the child component TS?
I would think that it's an individual component. Oh, someone said, what up?
No, sir.
What?
Oh, I was thinking it was a child component, so we're creating the delete button individually on the child, and we might have to output that information to the parent.
So you're saying that since it's part of this, it should be part of this component, it's this delete button part of this component, the functionality should be handled by this component,
Yes.
specifically the record component. Okay. And for the people that are arguing parent, why would you think it goes on the...
It lives on the root or on the parent.
Fair enough. Fair enough. If it's actually in the child's HTML, it has to communicate with the child's TS file. But that's the difference, is that you could, like I think I was explaining to you actually yesterday, you could have that delete button in the child HTML with its own click, right? It's an event that's listening. But the logic, the thing that runs the child's, sorry, I'm not even in this video. The thing that runs the child component is the child component's TS file, right? So what we'd have to do if we set it up this way, where this was all part of the HTML of the record, we would have to essentially handle that function on the child's TS file, but notify the parent that something happened, right? Because this child, it didn't go and talk to the service to communicate anything to the service. It's just a dumb little record component that just shows our information, right? It's got an input coming in. We've got this input coming in, so it knew what its record was, right? But it's not necessarily, we don't want each one of these components to be making their own requests to the service. We want it to be handled by the parent still, that communication by the parent. So even if we have the delete button here, we kind of have two steps to this process. So let's go with app component TS, app component HTML, and then let's go with record component TS and HTML, and record component HTML. Now, what we're about to talk about, these outputs, they're sort of that next level concept, right? So some of these things that you'll find in the optional section, they're going to be more geared toward, if you guys are shooting for that black belt, essentially, like some of the validation stuff, some of this output stuff, some of these more advanced features. But I wanted to show you guys this just because it's important for how we communicate within our application. And then we'll segue into the main topic of today, which is how to communicate when we're still routing things, which is where it gets kind of muddy. But right now, with these 4 files, I need some way for this child to essentially communicate an action that happens down here up to its logic unit, which is its TS file. I need to communicate that information to the parent's logic unit so that this service request can be made to actually delete the darn thing I'm talking about, right? In this way, this child, this simple little record, again, we're keeping it from making requests because it's just a simple little one-off thing. We don't want to do it in the advanced logic. We just want it to communicate that, hey, something happened, be aware of the thing that happened. And in order to do that, in my class, class, or exports class, record component, I have to implement something. First, I have to import input, and after I've got that, I'm essentially saying that this will have an input. What is our input called? What have we specified in the child? R, right? So it's going to have an input called R, and I'm going to say it's going to be a type of any. No, it's not, but this isn't Swift. I'm saying that I'm going to have an input called R, and it's going to be a type of any. So I'm telling the record component to expect to have some input at some point in time. I have to import this as well. Import input goes right next to the on and init at the top from Angular, essentially. Input called R, you're going to be getting some information. Then I would say something like, well, that's actually all we need. Then it has its ng on init, which wouldn't do anything for us, and then we can just display that R right here, right? I can just say R, with a JSON pipe, or I can say r.title, r.artist, etc., etc. So I can see that information here. Well, we've got our button, right? This guy. And our button's going to be a delete function, or will give us the ability to delete. Okay, so I've got a click, and this click will call a function, again, on our logic unit, the child's logic unit, right? So click will say del record, and I'll send it R. R being the record to delete, right? So the way this would work is I have a method here, del record, taking in R, which we can say is type any. It's going to be the record we want to delete. And somehow this function needs to communicate that this happened. Needs to communicate that we called it, right? So I can print R here to my heart's content. I can console log it. If I wanted to bring the service in, I could put it in my constructor and I could have this make a request. That would work just fine. What's up, Kate?
And you want to put it to the service when you have like a nested root, right?
We want to do it then, yeah. So roots and nested roots, we want to talk about the service. Each of these components communicating with the service at that point, yeah.
But if we're just iterating through like an array of things,
yeah,
and they're just like all there, we want to do like the input-output situation.
The reason we want to do the output for this case, right, this list of records on my main page, single app component showing my other component that is the record, right? If I delete something, and this communicated directly to the service, okay, I tell my server to delete this record. Server says, awesome, you did it. Congrats, you deleted the record. Do you think it would still appear on the app component?
If you didn't do the output, or if you didn't take it to the service.
If we didn't do the output or take it to we could actually take it to the service and it still wouldn't change the records shown.
Okay.
Yeah, we have to basically inform app component to get the newest version of all the records, right? Because if this action happens way down here in the child, yeah, it would delete, and it would delete just fine. But that just made an API request and told me to basically delete a resource on the API. The data, the array that I have that's still showing all my records would still be the same old array that's still showing all the records, right? So it would actually still be there. But if we do the output technique, we're basically saying, I don't want to handle that here. I just want to notify the parent something happened, and the parent was already fetching all the records, right? The parent already had the get all records methods and everything that we needed to do to make things pretty and show up there properly. So instead of doing anything here, we just say, hey parent, delete this thing. And the parent says, oh, for sure, I'll delete it, and I'll also then go ahead and update all the records on the page, because that needs to happen. And who's controlling all the records on the page? The app component or the record component? The app component, right? That's the thing that talked to the service. It's the thing that got all the records, and it's the thing that showed all the records, right? So it makes more sense for us to just say, hey, this event happened, you deal with it, you make things look good, and you get the newest version of the data. Versus this little guy trying to do all of that logic, because it's not suited for it.
Last question. I'm just curious, why wouldn't you, can you just route it back and ng on init refresh? What's the difference between that and output?
Router, you can do that too if you're going with the router. We're not even
refresh.
talking router at this point, but if you're going with the router, you can do that.
It's the same thing.
Can't do that with nested route stuff.
Okay.
Doesn't call the ng on init the same way. So we'll talk about how we get around that too. But the normal process for each of these guys, if they were doing an event, if that event happened all the way down in this actual child's component level, we would need to tell the parent that this happened. Okay? So in order to do that, we create an output. Add output. And we say, let's see, we can call it del event emitter or something like that. And you can almost think about these guys like sockets, right? I'm just shouting that something happened. If anyone's listening, they'll understand that it happened. That's it. So I'm going to say create an output called del event emitter and set it equal to a new instance of an event emitter. If I can spell E, 1M, 2 T's, right? New event emitter. All right, cool. I did it right there. I was going to do it wrong here. Awesome. That's cool. So I've got this del event emitter, which you can again think about as this little socket, right? So when I delete a record, hey, this dot del event emitter dot emit, and I'm going to emit something. So this in and of itself would show that an event happened. What's the something I should shout out? R, the record I want to delete, right? All right, so this is the shout. This is saying, hey, this happened. Did it delete anything yet? Did anything actually get deleted? No, right? This is just someone notifying the system that, hey, I want to delete this. So if anyone's listening, go ahead and delete that, right? But this in and of itself does nothing. It's half of it. It's the shout, right? We need the ears. We need someone listening. So in order to do that, let's kind of blow this up here. We had, our app record. Let's go H1, records. Wow, awesome. And enter H1. And then here, we have app record, right? We're going to generate this as an ng4, just the same way we did a second ago. ng4, let record of records. All right, so that is essentially saying, hey, create this many times, right? Doesn't deal with any input. Then let's set up our input. Variable r on the child is going to have a value of this record, right? This singular record. Okay, so that's our input. Now we have to deal with the parent, essentially the output. So the first argument, it's almost a similar pattern as this. Child equals parent, essentially. We can think about it that way. We've got a del event emitter, and we set it equal to, what do you think is going to go here? Well, so this is the emitter, right? I'm saying, hey, this is the shout. What do you think would be the action that would follow? Delete. Some function on the parent's TS file. Some function that's essentially saying, hey, I'm listening. When it happens, I'm going to run this function. So I'm going to say del record. I'll put a P to denote that it's a parent. Taking in, and actually this syntax is a little different for it, $event. And it's just the way that we can capture the event happening and also the parameters sent, or the arguments sent. So $event goes in this del record P. Now where does this del record P, where is that going to be defined? The parent's TS. All right, so we've got our class, export class app component, and we've got this del record P, taking in R, which is of type any. And what do you think this function is going to do? Delete, right? It's going to communicate with
Service.
the service.
Express and Mongo.
Yeah, exactly that, all the way down, right? So this function would actually do the deleting, which is actually communicating with the service, express, etc. But this is where the actual magic happens, right? Where the delete happens. So let's follow it back for just a second here. So I'm creating a number of records, basically matching the records that my app component got, right? ng on init, it gets all records. We've done that a couple times now, right? Getting all of the things and showing them on page. For each one of these, I didn't just make a div, but I made a component, right? Generated the component. And for each of those components, I gave it some data. The data being that specific record for that pass of the loop, right? So you've got this record, this record, this record. Okay. So that record exists in this child component now via this input. And notice the pattern. Child variable, parent variable. Child function, parent function, or child emitter, parent function. So alongside this input, I also expected, essentially linked an output. And I said, if I hear this thing go off, call this function. That's it. If I hear some child say, I want to delete this thing, call this function that exists again. This is the app component HTML connected to the app component TS. So we'll call this function. Okay, so if we're actually generating these record, components of these children, we've got our inputs. For each of these, we have an output, which is, hey, del event emitter, right? And I'm saying this will be an event emitter, sort of this thing that announces to the application that something happened. And if a user clicks a button in the child's HTML, that's an event. It's an event that triggers a child function, del record, normal function, right? But that normal function tells the emitter to shout, to emit, to say, hey, someone clicked the delete button somewhere. This is happening. And alongside that function call, or with it, we send an argument, the record to delete. So hey, delete Wu-Tang. Don't delete Wu-Tang. Delete Wu-Tang, enter the Wu-Tang, 36 chambers, whatever, right? So we're shouting delete this record. Who's listening? The parent component, because of this line right here, because of this attribute that we set in the tag. We're saying, hey, I linked this to a function. So if this goes off, run this function. Well, where's del record P? Where's that declared? The parent's component TS. And here we would just simply, call and subscribe this HTTP service dot, del record, whatever function exists on the service, to accept, say, a record underscore ID, right? R underscore ID, and subscribe, etc., right? When we subscribe, we're taking in data, and we're saying, hey, do X, Y, and Z. So this would subscribe to it. It would delete the thing, right? If the service worked properly, it would delete it. And then we would also want to run this dot, get records, or whatever function we defined that already provided the data to the parent. In turn, if we really took it one step further, the get all records function runs that exists on the parent. It talks to the service, it gets all the records, which updates the data, right? My all records array or records array, which then re-triggers this render, which would then display the newest version of the records list, essentially. The one missing now because it got deleted. So this is outputs normally. This is outputs when we're saying, hey, I have a parent-child relationship between a parent component and a child component. And it exists on that page as an actual tag, as an actual app record. So this is pretty tricky. Now when we're doing it with a service, well, not with a service, when we're doing it with outlets, we actually do it different than this. So I just want to show you different ways that we can communicate this information. Now again, this will be really highlighted. If you look at the optional section, you look specifically at outputs, you'll see how this is working. You'll see this explained in depth. There's not an assignment to go along with it. It's just reading and working through an example. It's okay, Jay?
We're good.
Cool. All right, so let's talk about the difference between this versus doing something with routers, which is kind of what we're getting into. We want to see these routed components. So essentially, instead of having this app record here in my app component TS, I'm going to do a little strike through because I've really just got router outlet. That's my tag. And what does the router outlet act as?
Oh, right.
That like app.
Something about that? What's that?
That like would act like app root where you can pass
Yeah,
through.
it acts like an app root, right? The app root that exists on index.html, right? And what does that do for me?
Probably on the
Those new pages.
I mean, essentially, we're placing the HTML there. We're saying, it's all Ajax, right? So we're not refreshing, we're not getting a new page. We're saying take this HTML and put it right there in the DOM, essentially. And I'm creating, just like app root creates one for me in my index.html, the router outlet creates one for me in a component. And I'm going to say this app component, sorry, I have a sore throat, so I know I'm drinking a lot of water. So essentially, this app component wouldn't really work as the main brains, the main operation to get the data and send the data all around. We just really route things in and out of here that are each responsible for their data. So one of these components, one of the things we might show in the router outlet would, in fact, be this whole thing, this records list, right? So let's say that's a component. Record list. The record list is a page, essentially, that's comprised of, and we could go with the children at this point, or we could even just say repeat the div, but that communication between the app, the record that gets generated, and this would essentially be the same communication we had between this record and the app component. It's just we're not bubbling it all the way up to the app component. We're only bubbling it up to the record list. So what I mean to say is if we had these same repeated elements here, I know I'm Picasso up here right now, so sorry you guys can't get on my level, but whatever. So this record list component HTML, it essentially has app record, ng4, that record of records. It's got all that stuff in its HTML. This is also, we want to say it's connected to the service. Because there's no real way for me to tell the app component to fetch all the data to send it to a child. Because the router outlet does not act like a child of a component. Think about it. If I had different pages being shown here at different times, how do I know which inputs and outputs to put here in this? As a
component, can you just send it to the app.components, the main one? Like input, output, same situation?
Well, the app component would be trying to input things into other children, if you will, but they're not really children, they're just routed components. There's no real way to disseminate information down into the routed components that way.
Okay.
So it's more so that the app component really just exists to have some header, to have some thing. You know, it could still have a connection to the service, but it probably won't be doing a whole lot there. Honestly, we generate a component, we route that component into the app component's router outlet, and in that way we're showing this. But this is acting like the brains now for the page shown, right?
So app.component.ts is generally going to be empty in terms of
Yeah, if we're doing routed components, a lot of routed components, app component TS really won't have much going on. Empty. It's just essentially acting as the router, you know, just basically the place to put things. Now each of these pages rendered, or each of these things shown, I should say, would connect with the service. So say I have a record list, and say I have an add record, right? Both of these components, because now they're working as sort of the whole view, essentially the whole thing that's being shown, they're both individually connected to the service. Now my service doesn't need to change, and I don't need multiple services, right? I can have the same service that's being shared amongst these components. So in that way, you know, okay, I click delete, and let's still say this is a child. Let's still say that in this record list.html, I'm doing the same thing. I'm making nested children, right? I'm putting children components into this page when it's shown. Well, who would this delete have to shout to, or who would be listening? App component or the record list component?
The record list component?
The record list component, right? It just bubbles up to its, essentially it outputs that this event happened to, you know, the parent. And the parent says, oh, I'll talk to the service, right? And then the service goes back and we update this view. This really doesn't have anything to do with the app component anymore. This guy's running the show. Similarly, if I had my form, you know, and then I had a big old add button here, who would this communicate with? Really just to this component, right? The add record, which would talk to the service, which would add a thing. The router might kick in at that point. We'd want to reroute to the all record component or something like that, which we could do. But in that way, we just add a record. This page communicates with the service, then we redirect to this view. So this is going to be more of the standard flow for how we do things, where we have the router outlet just essentially serving up these different pages. Now, it's not really being served up in the same sense as before, right? But once we get all of our standard Angular out of the way, this is going to be the main workflow. This is what you guys can expect on Monday, having different pages shown that are each handling interactions, but they themselves, these components can communicate with the service. That's definitely fine. So it gets a little tricky, but honestly, you can see that most of this would just exist in the same record list HTML. And the same handling would be handled not in app component TS, but in a record list TS. But there's not much that actually needs to change. Now the final thing I want to talk about for this morning, because we'll do this action this afternoon of having these sort of different pages being shown, routing two different pages, and having interactions on different pages. It might take a little bit of time this afternoon, because honestly it takes a little bit of time. But there is another technique to actually put more components on a page. And it's not nested components. What it is it's nested routes. Now this is where it gets really weird. Yeah, I know it's been like really easy up until now, so get ready because this part's gonna get hard. This is where it gets real weird. So I have one router outlet, right? I've got a router outlet on my app component HTML. There's nothing else going on in the HTML, right? Other than a header. So everything is being shown there. Can I put another router outlet on this component's HTML page?
Absolutely, that's a nested route.
That's a nested route. And so this is where it starts to get real funky. So I have this whole page being shown in what is the router outlet for app component, right? Similarly, I can have another router outlet at the bottom that I can put another component into, essentially. I can say, take this whole add form and have that just be a component that shows on a router outlet here. And that'll work for me. Nested routes work. It makes communication a lot trickier because the same problem exists. This component to the app component.ts versus the nested route component to this page. I can't communicate through the router outlet. So that's the caveat, that's the hard part. So how do I do this?
Uncommitted routes.
I don't know if that helps me, because say I'm trying to add something, right? I added something in a component that was generated through a router outlet. Who do I shout to? Who do I tell that I added this thing? Who do I tell to update this page that shows all my things?
Parent.
But it doesn't have a parent because I can't communicate through the router outlet.
Oh, crap.
It doesn't work like a normal child. It doesn't work like just app record would, right? I can provide an input and get an output. I cannot do that with a router outlet. So there's a really interesting thing about observables that we haven't really talked about because it's that sort of next level. But when I described observables in the past, I kind of talked about them like kind of very beefy promises, very beefy callbacks, right? A callback that will essentially make sure that I get the data when it's available. Now there's a little bit more to it than that. An observable is actually a structure that we can set up and point it to a data source. And when that data source changes, I can actually subscribe and see the changes to the data source. So if I said, observe this array, and the array changes, anywhere in my application that subscribed to that observable that I generated would be notified that that array changed. Or would be notified that some event happened. So it gets real funky because I can actually subscribe to an event emitter. And so if this event gets emitted at any point in time, anywhere in my application, say this app component, TS file, subscribe to some event emitter, right? Some add or delete or whatever. No matter where I am in my application, if I activate and emit from that event emitter, that component is going to see it. So we can do this through a shared service. Now this doesn't make sense just, speaking about it. So I'll do this afternoon. We'll see this functionality. But I would highly suggest that if you guys can understand nested routes, that's awesome. Nested routes honestly make communication a lot harder. I think it's much easier just to have a regular, relationship between a parent and a child just in a single nested component, right? Or a routed component. Nested routes start to get real funky with how we can pass information around. But the trick is we can subscribe to something in the service. And if it ever changes, I'll be notified across the board. So even if there's no direct link between this add form, for instance, if this was a nested route component that existed here, there's no direct correlation between it and, let's say, this record list, right? Because it's done through the router outlet. There's no communication through it. So what this would do would essentially say, okay, I'm going to add something. I'm actually going to communicate with the service directly because I have to at this point. And that service that I communicated with, the method would emit an event. Now, anyone subscribed, which I would have had to subscribe on init here, anyone subscribed will see that that event happened, and they'll know to then go and refresh their data or do what they need to do. So subscription to events is pretty wacky. Observables in general, using them like this is their real strength, but it's also the most complicated thing about them. That's why we've kind of gotten away from it. I'm trying to give you guys a sneak peek at how they're typically used, because honestly, this is the biggest strength of Angular, is that in any part of my application, I can already have things that were waiting and looking for changes. And in that way, I can have it seamlessly updated without having to have a bunch of inputs and outputs between every single component that exists on the page. Now, we will want to work within the confines of the inputs and outputs as much as possible, but when you get these problems with these router outlets, that's the best way to get around it. So I'll show you guys that this afternoon when we code out that demo. I'll try to fit that in there. We'll talk about the communication between unrelated components on our application. Cool? Questions? No? Yeah, fair enough. This technique though, I'm having some information handled by the record list. It happens to be a routed component, right? But if you start to, I know it's confusing in the beginning because we got routes in Express, now we got routes in Angular, what's being shown, what is this, what is that? If you think about the router, try to dumb it down. Try to dumb it down to the point where I'm just serving a page. If I'm serving a page, that component, or I'm serving a component, that component's now in charge of its own data, its own communication with the service, it's in charge of its children. That's it. And in that way, we can still give our children inputs, we can still get output events from the children in this routed component, or in this routed component, right? They can all communicate with the service, they can all do what they need to do here. So we'll do that this afternoon. What's up?
Can you just pass data like you normally do through a parameter and a URL, and then?
Yeah, you can do that too. That's a different way, but we can't do everything that way. I can't pass information like, if I didn't want my URL looking really wacky, I can't pass information like, hey, a new thing just got created, right? I can just go back to /movies. But when you're using nested routes, like I said, the ng on init doesn't fire when you think it should. So that's why it doesn't automatically do the update, if you will. But yeah, some of the ways that we'll be transferring information as far as like all records, single record, edit record, delete record, say we're going that way, I can use URL parameters the same exact way I use URL parameters in my Django applications and my Express server. I'm essentially saying, hey, route to somewhere. When I click this button, go to /move or /records /record ID. Well, if this is my single record component, right, and it has access to the service, it can get the ID on init. It can call the service to get the single record, to give it the record, right? So that's the normal process. That's the normal way we just transfer data around in our system. Is we can still do the URL parameters almost the same exact way, and I'll be today too. Yeah. What's up?
No, I just inception myself. Never mind.
Nice. Yeah, almost like, so at first we build this app component that has all the data, that has all the information, that has all of the communication happening. Now we're taking that functionality, we're kind of splitting it up into different locations.
Okay, I got it. That's the components. Does it prevent information from being duplicating, or does that?
Duplicated in the Mongo database, or duplicated
for example, you would use just a regular child component to produce a form.
Yeah.
And then if you submit that form, I guess I feel like it would submit the same information X number of times. So I'm thinking does a nested component prevent all of that?
It doesn't necessarily prevent that. The biggest feature of a nested component is that you can have this sort of reusable piece that I can just call wherever I need it. So I can say, hey, if I had an add form here, I can pull up my add form, but then I can also pull up my add form in another location and use it like an edit form or something like that. I'd have to change some other stuff about it. That's not a really good example, but like one of these record boxes, maybe this appears in the all records, and then maybe it also appears in a single record page. And then say there's a user's list of favorite records, maybe it also appears there. So it's this nice reusable component that expects to get a record. It would have the delete button attached at all times, and that delete event exists as well. So this little package that I can just use and move around as a nested component, this comes in handy because I don't have to rewrite the same code over and over. I can just say, hey, use that component that I generated.
So it's like the component and within that component there's a component.
Yeah, exactly like that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, because this whole record list is a component comprised of child components. But the important distinction is because this record list is being shown via, is it a nested component or is it a routed component?
Routed.
Routed. And because it's a routed component, there's no direct communication between the routed component and the thing that routed it. There is a line of communication between a child component and its parent component. Via what?
Input outputs.
Inputs and outputs. We can input output between parent and children. We cannot input output between component and the router.
But you could pass parameters, and you could also send stuff to the service, and when you switch the page, refresh that data all the time, and it will do the exact same thing as emitting.
Yeah, essentially. Well, it wouldn't do the exact same thing as emitting, but I mean, it would do a similar feature, right? And that's what we'll do this afternoon. We'll try to do it as much as possible without doing outputs, and I think we'll be just fine. Now, I would honestly, so I'll probably end the video there. Hold on a second. Video. Get my nice mug here at the end for those watching. Okay, cool.
Those ones.